So my name is Katie. I'm a librarian at Lyon Township Public Library, and I'm very pleased to be hosting our speaker tonight. I manage the marketing outreach and some of the adult events you see here at Lyon Township Public Library. So if you're familiar with our website and you've attended events before, thank you so much for joining us. I love feedback, so feel welcome to reach out to me at any time. In the chat box, there should be an option you can click on the Lyon Township Library, which is me, and you can send me a message. You can always call the main line and ask one of my colleagues to transfer you over to my phone, and that's at 248-437-8800. Now, before I introduce Kathryn, I just wanted to touch on a little bit of housekeeping. I have a little bit to say before we start, so I'm just going to go ahead and start talking. Tonight's program is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel and Facebook after some editing. All audience members are muted and will be throughout the duration of tonight's talk. The chat function is available for asking questions at any time. Either I will be monitoring it and I'll be keeping track of it. Please keep respectful in your communications in the chat. Anything considered disruptive or counterproductive may result in removal from this Zoom presentation. Kathryn will answer all questions from the audience at the end of her presentation, but don't worry, I'll make sure that nobody is missed and every question posed in the chat will be asked for her to answer. Next, we want to thank all of you for your continued support and patronage of libraries during this difficult time. Our communities benefit from the shared resources that libraries provide in person and online. And we're always grateful for all of the feedback, kindness, and encouragement from you. So thank you so much. We'd like to encourage you to join us for our annual summer reading program. Registration is ongoing, but the annual summer reading event will end on August 15th, and that's about a month away. Find the link to register on our website. Just visit ltpl.org and look for the event calendar tab. If you hover your mouse over that, you should see a drop-down menu, and in that list is a summer reading option. We're using an online reading tracking system called Read Squared that you can log your minutes that you've spent reading, completed activities, and attendance at virtual library events like this one. But we're also providing an alternative means of participating for summer reading. We have weekly take and make kits that you need to sign up for on our website every week in order to receive. So that one on our website is under the youth tab and not the event calendar. And this summer has been full of fun events for all ages, so we hope you've been enjoying what we've been offering. And we hope you continue to join us for future events. And one event I'd like to mention is tomorrow. Our resident Green Thumb, Pam, is presenting on planning for a fall garden. And that is going to start at 6:30 p.m. So make sure you register on our event calendar in order to get the link to join in on her talk. On Thursday, we have another Zen doodling event with Paul. He's coming back. This program begins at 4 p.m. and is geared toward children 7 years old up to teenagers. And just in case, I want to let you know if we do experience any disruptions in the Zoom meeting, to please bear with us if we need to do some troubleshooting. We're still learning as we host and run our virtual events, so I just want to thank you in advance. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Kathryn Remlinger is Professor of English in the Applied Linguistics program at Grand Valley State University. She teaches a variety of undergraduate and graduate linguistics courses, including sociolinguistics, history of English language, language and gender, language and power, and an introduction to language study. In general, her work focuses on the intersection of language, place, and identity, and more specifically on how the idea of dialect has emerged over time in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. In collaboration with undergraduate students, she recently conducted a linguistic landscape study in Holland, Michigan to investigate how Dutchness is communicated in public spaces and the effects this has on belonging and exclusion. Her current research is a collaborative project investigating the use and meanings of ja in Danish heritage community in Utah and a Finnish heritage community in the Upper Peninsula. Her previous research examined intersections of language, gender, and sexuality in higher education. An important aspect of her work has been public outreach in order to foster language awareness and understanding about the effects of language attitudes on individuals and communities. Kathryn's work has had popular appeal and appears in magazines, newspapers, and on YouTube. Kathryn serves as president-elect and program chair of the American Dialect Society and previously served as associate editor of the Society's journal, American Speech. She earned a Ph.D. in rhetoric and technical communication with specialization in sociolinguistics, composition theory, and gender studies. Oh, I'm gonna meet some people here. And that was from Michigan Technological University. She holds an MA in English and a BA in Sociology and French with a secondary education teaching certification from Morehead State University in Kentucky. So without any further ado, I welcome Kathryn to our community and thank you so much for taking time to share your research and expertise with us.
Thanks so much, Katie. Can you hear me okay?
I can.
Great. Okay, so hello everyone and good evening. I'd like to start by thanking the people and organizations who've made my research in this presentation possible. Thank you to Lyon Township Public Library for hosting the event and to Katie Rothley for inviting me to give the presentation. I'm also grateful to many others who've supported my work. Of course, Grand Valley State University and the English department, where I teach linguistics, as you heard, to the students and my colleagues there. Also to University of Wisconsin Press that published my book, Yooper Talk, Dialect as Identity in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. The many participants who you'll see some of them in this study today and who made my research possible. And my friends and family, some of them are here today and that's really exciting for me. And of course, all of you. It's such a joy for me to share my research with you tonight. My presentation will focus on the social and linguistic histories of English in the Upper Peninsula, or Yooper Talk, and I'll explain how the dialect has emerged over time. Excuse me. To describe the dialect, I'll focus on three main areas that make a dialect: the sounds, or what we call phonology, the lexical features, or vocabulary, and then the grammatical structures or word order and how people put phrases. To stay on track, you might be already be able to tell, I'm going to be reading a little bit, and I look forward to your questions and comments following my presentation. I focus my research in the northwestern Upper Peninsula from Marquette west through the Keweenaw Peninsula that you see here circled. I chose this region for a couple of reasons. One, I had the most contacts here, and that made it easy for me to conduct interviews, to find people to interview, to ask friends of friends who I should interview. Also because I knew the communities well and I knew where to go to collect data. Also because this is the area, and this is more significant than my connections there, because you can always make connections somewhere, is that this is where the stereotypical recognizable Yooper voice comes from. Sometimes people will call this a Finn voice or Finlander for Finnish Americans, and I'll talk about why that is in a little bit. I'm particularly interested in the idea of a dialect and how it has emerged over time through social and historical events, such as immigration and language contact as people came together and mixed and mingled. I'm also interested in economic factors like mining, agriculture, timber, and tourism, and language attitudes that we have and that we reinforce through, media such as movies, TV, social media posts, and memes, our everyday conversations with friends and family in classrooms and at work. This evening, I'll explain that the dialect, its words, its sounds, its phrases, how people put phrases together, how they order words, are a result of social factors and historical events that continue to draw people to the region. Excuse me. To understand what makes a dialect, it's important to know its history. The history of English in the Northwestern Upper Peninsula is relatively recent compared to other dialects, regional dialects in the United States. It wasn't until the mid-19th century that English speakers regularly visited and then inhabited the region. The dialect's recent history, combined with the area's isolation, the people who've immigrated there and settled there, where they've settled, who they've mixed and mingled with, the languages that they spoke or continue to speak, are all factors that maintain the dialect and its distinct features. You see here 5 main factors that have helped the dialect to develop into the variety that it is. One is geography, particularly isolation. And if you see on this previous slide, this area, it takes about 4.5 or 5 hours, depending on how fast you drive, to get here to the Mackinac Bridge, about 10 or 12, depending on the weather, to Detroit. Same over here where I live. To get to Green Bay, Wisconsin is another 5 hours from here. So it's quite geographically isolated. And that's one reason that the dialect has been able to be maintained. But I'll talk also how it's changed and why it's changed too. So isolation, geographical isolation. Another is historical events. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, such as the French-Prussian War, World War I, that pushed people toward other places, including the UP. Language contact between speakers of English and other languages, including Italian, Polish, German, French, specifically Canadian French, Finnish, Ojibwe, or what's also known as Anishinaabemowan, and many other languages. Economic factors that I had mentioned, mining, tourism, agriculture, timber, and the sale of and availability of land. And language attitudes, what we think of as good and bad English. These all affect what makes a dialect and how it's emerged over time. To begin though, I want to have this important definition. I'm assuming you all know what a Yooper is. Here's a definition from the Merriam-Webster Collegiate Dictionary, which added the word in 2014. As you no doubt know, the name derives from the acronym for UP, Yooper, right? Because Yooper is a well-known word in Michigan and other places in the upper Midwest specifically, you might be surprised that it wasn't until 2014 that the word became an entry in a dictionary, and especially a popular dictionary like Merriam-Webster's Collegiate. There's an interesting Scrabble story why and how the word got into this dictionary. Steve Parks was playing Scrabble with a friend in 2002, and he wanted to use the word Yooper. And his partner, his playing partner, said, no, you can't use it. It's not in any dictionary that we have here. What he did was he started a 12-year letter writing campaign to Merriam-Webster to convince them that Yooper should be in the dictionary. When he first solicited them, the editors, they said, well, it's not widely known enough. There's not enough evidence to put this word in the dictionary. Now, this might be shocking to some of you, I know, because of how popular Yooper is for many of us. But finally in 2014, Parks had sent enough evidence to convince the editors that the word should be in the dictionary and that it's well known enough to be dictionary worthy. And if you look in the Collegiate Dictionary, you'll find Yooper right between your and you-who. It wasn't until the mid-1970s, though, that the term Yooper was popularly used in print in the UP, as you can see from this timeline. It's important to realize, though, that despite the word not being in print until 1975, surely it was used in spoken language before then. Words have to appear in spoken language before they ever become printed or in popular press. So you can see here, the first evidence we found is 1975, Yooper from the Pick and Axe, which is a newspaper, was a newspaper in Bessemer, Michigan. And what's interesting to me, in these examples, we can see attitudes at work about what it means to be a Yooper and how that gets connected to what it means to sound like a Yooper. For example, in 1982, sociologist Michael Luukkonen, he's a professor at Northern Michigan University, and he's a filmmaker. He attempted to make a documentary about the cultural phenomenon of Yoopers, and he wanted to call it that. But there was a lot of criticism, especially from older community members, that he shouldn't use the word Yooper because for some people it's a derogatory term. And there's not a lot of pride associated with it for some people because of how it's been used in negative ways. So instead he named his film Good Man in the Woods. In 1983, we start seeing connections between the language and the place. And you can see this in Jack Bauer's bumper sticker. Jack Bauer's lives in Marquette, and he created a bumper sticker. Maybe you have this on your car or you've seen it. Say ya to the UPA. And what I find interesting here is that, one, he uses some dialect features like ya and da for the and the a. But also, this was a response to a tourism campaign by the state of Michigan that said, say yes to Michigan. And some of their promotional materials left the UP off the map. So, or the map of Michigan. So you can see this was a form of resistance as well as pride in what it means to sound like a Yooper. In 1986, there's a band now called the Yoopers. Before that, they were called the Yoopers. So something's happening in the 1980s where people start connecting people, language, and place. The Yoopers changed their name to the Yoopers. And I'll talk about this the connection later. So what you also can see here is that the term Yooper has these contested meanings, and you can see that from Michael Luukkonen's film and changing the name there. I should also point out that I didn't want to call my book Yooper Talk for that reason, but I can answer that in the questions why I ended up calling it that, and it was by the publisher's choice, but there's a reason behind it. So we have to be aware that Yooper isn't always something that's a positive term. Sometimes it can be a negative term. Over the past 30 years, connotations of Yooper, though, have become better or what we call ameliorated. There's more and more pride associated with it. And I think part of that has to do with the tourism industry. And I can talk more about that too when we have questions and answers if you're interested. I want to go back now and talk a little bit about the history, and I'll be reading from my book here. For at least 5,000 years, Ojibwe have lived in the UP, yet it wasn't until the 1600s that French missionaries, French Canadian voyageurs, and European explorers regularly visited the area. And now remember, I'm talking about the northwest part. The eastern side, over by Sault Ste. Marie, had earlier history. Over the next century, expeditions were made to investigate the rich iron and copper deposits, which led to a determined effort to mine the region. Discovery of the world's largest deposit of native copper in 1842 drew thousands specifically to the Keweenaw Peninsula. From 1840 through the early 1900s, it was a booming timber and copper mining region. You had to log the timber before you could get at the land or the copper. It boasted a population of 80,000 in 1900. And in contrast today, the most recent census for the Keweenaw Peninsula and the Keweenaw areas, Baraga, Houghton, and Keweenaw counties, the population is about 46,000. So it's roughly half of what it was in 1900. As a result of the copper boom, the region became known as the Copper Country, and most adults were in some way connected to the mines and the mining industry. The majority of those who came to work in the mines and related industries, such as timber, settled in the Marquette area and copper country. They were Finnish, Cornish, Italian, French, Swedish, Croatian, Norwegian, German, Slovenian, and others. In addition, people settled from the Midwest, and the East Coast, especially Boston. In addition to being pulled to the region, historical events such as war and famine pushed people to the UP from Scandinavia, Great Britain, Central and Eastern Europe, and beyond. While some people settled in rural areas, others were attracted to larger towns like Marquette, Ontonagon, Houghton, Hancock, with the promise of prosperity earned from businesses and shops. Collectively, industry, agriculture, education, commerce were needed to sustain the burgeoning communities. The growing population and seemingly endless supply of copper and iron continued to draw laborers, merchants, artisans, teachers, and others to the regions through the early 1900s, when production slowed and immigration restrictions curtailed or limited people of certain nationalities from entry into the US. With the new arrivals came many languages. For example, the group of Norwegians that you see in this photo here and their cute little dog, no doubt spoke Norwegian, but they might have spoken Swedish and Danish too, depending on where they were from in Norway. They might have also spoken Finnish. Heritage languages and cultural practices were maintained through interactions at home, in neighborhoods, rural communities, social organizations, and through church services. For example, in Calumet alone, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, there was St. Anthony's Parish. It was a Polish church. St. Joseph's Parish, a German church. St. Louis, a French church, or probably Saint Louis. Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary was an Italian church, and St. John the Baptist was a Croatian church. So you can see that people maintain their languages in ways socially and through other activities, and no doubt at home, of course, too. Excuse me. Calumet school records from 1908 show that there were students from 40 different nationalities. We can assume that those students spoke at least half as many languages. Evidence of multilingual communities also include Houghton Hancock area newspapers that were printed in 6 different languages in the early 1900s. Because the majority of residents or settlers, new settlers, immigrants, were not native English speakers, they typically learned English from other non-native speakers. So what developed over time was an accented English. As people mixed and mingled and their languages came into repeated contact with English, a new variety of English slowly took shape. These languages affected the sounds, the words, and grammar that collectively form what we recognize today as Yooper Talk, and I'll give some examples in a minute. Out of all of the languages spoken in the area, Finnish has had a significant effect on English in the Northwestern UP. Other languages have too, and I'll give you some examples, but Finnish has had a lasting effect. And the influence of Finnish on English is significant for several reasons that resulted in decades of contact between Finnish and English. The Finns were the largest group to immigrate, and they were one of the last groups to immigrate. And they tended to be literate, and I'll talk about why that's significant. Whereas immigrant languages are typically lost by the 3rd generation in a family, so the 1st generation tends to be more heavily on the heritage or the family language and speak some English. We'll say that, let's say in the United States, it would be English. The 2nd generation is often bilingual, and by the 3rd generation, it's monolingual English, and it's true then as it is today. But Finnish was different. It was maintained for 4 and 5 generations, in part because Finns tended to be literate, whereas other immigrants tended not to be. In order to get married in Finland, you had to be able to read and write and sign your name. It's also partly because Finnish is more of a kind of see and say language where the alphabet and the sounds match each other, unlike English, as you well know. It's more difficult because our spelling, and that's a whole nother story, but Finnish is literacy in Finland is a little bit more easy than other languages for that reason. But Finnish was maintained for 4 and 5 generations, in part because of literacy. And that literacy enabled families and people, speakers, Finnish speakers, to read, write, maintain their language at home, at church, social organizations, writing letters back and forth to Finland. The other reason is that Finns maintain their language longer was that Finnish is not related to English, and most of the other immigrant languages, German, Italian, French, Swedish, Norwegian, Danish, those are Polish, those are all related to English, so it's easier for those speakers to learn English than it is for someone who speaks a language not related to English, like Finnish, to learn English. The long contact between Finnish and English shaped the sounds, words, and some grammatical structures of English, and thereby characterizing what we would hear today as Yooper Talk. Next, we'll see how language contact, not only between English and Finnish, but also other languages, has affected the sounds, or what we say in linguistics, the phonology of the dialect. Evidence of language contact is heard in the dialect's phonology or sounds, and I'm using the phonetic alphabet, the International Phonetic Alphabet, to represent these sounds, and I'll describe them to you. Some of them are obvious, like the D that you see in brackets here for the or what we call the voice th, like you would hear in der, dem, dos for there, them, those, or duh for the in say ja, da, dup, or escanaba de moonlight. So, excuse me, some sounds or phonemes are represented with symbols that might be unfamiliar to you. So the second one, you see the glottal stop. It looks like a question mark without the dot. That is actually a sound, or really the absence of a sound, that you hear an uh-oh. And I'm gonna have you practice this so you can feel it and hear it. We call it a glottal stop because the air comes up out of your lungs into your throat to your glottis, and it stops. Your velum, or the soft palate, moves back and stops the air. You didn't know you were going to have a little phonology lesson tonight, did you? So when you put your hand on your throat and out loud, you need to say, uh-oh, and you can feel your larynx or your Adam's apple do a little jump. And that's the air coming up and stopping. And then that absence of sound is that in there is the glottal stop. You'll hear that in some speakers on the UP. When I say Houghton, I have that glottal stop. I don't say Houghton. Or some speakers will say south instead of south with the glottal stop, or they might have a T sound on the end, south. Or people might say boat for both, or boat for both, B-O-T-H. The S sound sometimes, especially with older speaker, this isn't as common of a sound you'll hear anymore. The S is substituted for SH. For example, you might hear somebody at a bar order a sot and a beer, or a shot and a beer. We also have voiceless stress stops and stress voiceless stops, excuse me. And those are when the t, p, k sounds are final syllable in a word, like winter, book, stop, hot. They'll be stressed more. And that's a direct relationship from Finnish. The back ass sound, like in pasty and camp, the tongue, when I say back and low, it's all about the tongue. And the tongue goes back and low for some speakers. So you might hear something more like pasty or camp versus what I say pasty and camp. The O sound might sound more like boat, where I might say boat. So again, the tongue goes back and down. The ow and the I sound, before these voiceless sounds or sounds like s and f, they get raised, and it's actually called Canadian raising because it's common in Canada in vowels. So you'll hear, for example, house, ice, wife, instead of house, ice, wife. And then the stress syllable, there's a town in the Keweenaw called Toivola, and some people say Toivola, and some people say Toivola, and you hear that switch. Now it's common in English to always stress the first syllable too, but this also is a carryover from Finnish, because Finnish always stresses every first syllable of every word, and English doesn't always. So those are some phonological features. There are other ones too, but these are some of the most common ones. It's important to remember that these are only some of the major sounds, and not everyone in the UP or even the Northwestern UP uses these sounds or uses them all the time. We vary the way we talk depending on who we're talking to, the topic, and all kinds of reasons that affect the context. The context affects our speech. And it's also important to remember that not everyone will sound this way, even if they're born and raised in the UP. So there's a lot of reasons why these sounds would exist or not exist for a certain speaker, and I won't get into that right now. In the next slide, we'll see how the phonology is also a clue to the sociolinguistic history of the area. This is Calcit-Lats is a result of the sociolinguistic history area, but also the symbolism is often lost on even local residents. And I'll talk a little bit about Calcit-Lats here. These are two street signs. The one in the foreground is handmade, and the one you see in the background is the official street name sign. This street that runs perpendicular here to, this is US 41 going up to, from Houghton, or excuse me, Hancock's below, you're going up toward Calumet. And in the background, you can see the Quincy mine hoist, some of the framing there or scaffolding. So these two signs are just outside of Hancock, and the Quincy mine today is a popular tourist destination. So if you've been there, you might have seen the official sign. The handmade sign is no longer there, and I'll give you a little of the history back behind that sign. Quincy mine was in full operation from 1846 until 1945, and many of the miners lived in company-owned housing that skirted the mine. And one of these housing communities was down this street that's now called Calcit-Lats. Many of the mining families had a cow, and with that, they would have a single stall barn or a cow shed attached to the house. Family members would take their cows to a communal pasture that were known as the flats. And they, or like a flats would be the pasture land. And this land was also provided by the mining company. In this community, there were a lot of Finnish speakers, and the pasture was jokingly called Calcit-Lats. And in the 1980s, Wilbur Salmi, who had lived in the area, he's now passed away, made this street sign and hung it here. The official street name didn't exist at this time. And I'll give you a little history about that too. But what he did was clever. He took the background of his official street names and the white lettering to make it look more official. He placed the sign at the intersection of Calcit-Lats and US 41. And at the time, streets didn't have official names in this area. Instead, they were known by homesteads or geographical features, mining locations, or even town names. In 2001, though, when the 911 emergency phone system came in, streets had to be named. And Wilbur Salmi petitioned the local township, Calumet Township Board, to name the street Calcit-Lats. In addition to the history behind the name, understanding its meaning relies on recognition of local linguistic features that have transferred from Finnish to English. If you remember, I said that oftentimes people who spoke Finnish English would do a S sound or S for the SH. Another feature of Finnish is that Finnish doesn't allow for consonant clusters or two consonants to be together at the beginning of a word. And I had said how the pasture land was called the flats. Well, this is called the lats because that F sound is dropped in order to fit Finnish pronunciation rules. So you've probably figured out that Calcit-Lats really is a joke, and it's Calcit-Flats. The pun is a result of language contact and transfer from English to Finnish, language transfer between English and Finnish. And I mentioned that Finnish doesn't have the SH sound, so it substitutes a S. Speakers will substitute an S. It doesn't have that consonant cluster, so speakers will drop the F to fit what they are more used to speaking. The other important thing is that Finnish alphabet doesn't have the letter C, and instead it uses the letter K for any of the K sounds. So that's why it's spelled this way. This sign gives us important evidence of the dialect features that emerged over time. But it also shows that the language has changed, or the dialect has changed, because today you won't hear people usually saying SH, they'll say an SH sound instead of the S. So you'll hear people say shot in a beer if they're at a bar, or other SH sounds like we might see here. Also, people will not say lats, they would say flats. So this is evidence of what the dialect has been and how it's changing. When people hear these different changes, they often think that the dialect is dying. It's not dying, it's changing. It has to change as society changes, as more people move in or move away, come back, their dialects mix and mingle, languages, new languages come in and dialects, or those languages mix and mingle. Dialects, like language everywhere else, has to change. It's always changing. It's one of the constants of life, but it's also one of the constants of language. It's constantly changing. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. I want to give you another example of a local dialect feature. The pronunciation of sauna, or what you might say is sauna, depending on where you are or who you are, is another example of language contact between English and Finnish, but also Swedish, Norwegian, German, and other European languages where speakers would pronounce sauna as sauna and not sauna. What's interesting here is that the pronunciation of sauna is what we call a shibboleth. It's an identity marker. It's an identity marker of people who are local. And sauna is an identity marker for people outside the area. So shibboleths are those insider-outsider pronunciations that mark who's local and who's not. Now that, again, doesn't mean that everybody in the UP says sauna. Not everybody does, but it's obviously from this insurance sign here that it is commonly used and recognized. This linguistic identity marker, the shibboleth, is really interesting to me too in this billboard, because in this set of billboards, it was outside of Ishpeming in 2015, we see it used and contrasted sauna with sauna. And what's interesting to me is how the insurance company uses this as a marketing tool. It's the local pronunciation isn't just about the local pronunciation, but it symbolizes a positive meaning about what it means to be local. Also that you can trust this insurance company. They're honest, they're reliable, they understand you and your insurance needs. And they're trustworthy overall because of that. And you can contact them easily because they're local. So to me, it's a really clever way of using language for showing this shibboleth, but also for marketing. Another example of a shibboleth is pasty. And this magnet emphasizes local ways of speaking and knowing by instructing presumably outsiders how to pronounce or not pronounce pasty. And what we hear today as local or sounding Yooper, though, like pasty and sauna or duff or say yada UPA, hasn't always been associated with the UP. And I want to go a little bit back in history to talk about that. Earlier in the early 1900s, before the dialect had fully emerged and people were speaking English more and more in the area, there were early associations with the dialect features that we recognize today as sounding Yooper that didn't connect with the place, but instead connected with nationalities and socioeconomic class. And here are two examples, both from 1905. And one is a folk song. It's The Wreck of the Julie Plant, which is a song about shipping on the Great Lakes. And the singers are French Canadians. And you can see the use of "de" here in the first line for "the," and in "then the" in the second line for "den da," "tro da" for "throw the," and "tree for" "three for." These same features I had mentioned for "de" for "the" and "t" for the "th" or the voiceless TH sound, like in "three" or "throw." Those were instead not related to the UP, but with what it meant to sound like French Canadian, or with other immigrant languages or other people who spoke English as a second language. Because those TH sounds, the and th, like in the and throw, are rare. English is one of the few languages that have these sounds. So speakers will substitute the next closest sound in their mouth, "de," for example, or "t," for those sounds. So we can see here how instead of signaling or meaning UP talk, this signals that someone here, in this example anyway, is French-Canadian speaker speaking English. The second example from the Cleveland Leader shows how this use of de for the and dat for that, and the use of yous for the plural you, like you all or you guys, is not connected with nationality, but here with working class. And we have to remember that these identities, working class and immigrant, overlap, and they still overlap today many times, as well as even in the UP, these sounds get connected with what it means to sound like a Yooper, but oftentimes that Yooper identity is also connected with a working class or ethnic identity, like being a Finlander. Excuse me, I'm just checking my notes here to make sure I covered everything. I think I did. All right, with that. So it's just a reminder that some sounds, these meanings attached to the sounds change just like the language changes over time. I'll talk now a little bit about the lexical features or vocabulary. These are some lexical features, and if you're familiar with the dialect or you grew up in the UP, especially the Northwestern UP, you're probably familiar with these and could add to the list for sure. Some of these lexical features or vocabulary reflect the various languages that have come into contact with the region. For example, Canadian French speakers gave us chook, Qatar, and make wood. Cornish English gave us bush and bloody and perhaps a, and I'll talk about the use of a in a little bit. For example, beautiful day, eh? From Irish English, we get the plural yous, and from Ojibwe or Anishinaabemowan, many place names and direct translations of place names. For example, you can see Munising, Keweenaw, Ishpeming, those are all Ojibwe terms. But Laughing Whitefish River is a direct translation from Ojibwe. And we also get place names from the Voyageurs, Presque Isle from Canadian French, and Lake Superior also from Canadian French. Foodways too, you can see foods listed here. We have foods from German, Finnish, Slovenian, and Croatian. And respectively, those give us bakery and miso and povatica. Bakery here meaning the baked goods themselves, not the place where it's cooked or made. Foodways and place names are some of the most significant ways that we have evidence of language contact and immigration patterns and settlement patterns. If you take a map of Michigan or your home state or whatever state you might be living in now, and you look at place names, you can usually tell if you recognize the languages or even look up the place names and where they've come from, the language history of the area. These are just a few examples, like I said, and I'm sure that you could add to the list. This image, which is actually from the cover of my book, and the Wisconsin Press had created this, shows a lot of the words that you might be familiar with, and some that I mentioned and some I didn't, like the expression holy wa that you see in the bottom here. And I don't know if you can see my cursor, ya and a. Over here is bakery, sauna, of course, pavatitsa, and others. Shopko is a name of a store, and go Shopko, let's go Shopko, and I'll talk a little bit about why people don't say let's go to Shopko. We see several examples, like I said, on this. And what's interesting to me that while some of these features are recognizable as Yooper Talk, like A for sure, and pasty, and you betcha, but others like bakery and are not recognizable. And that's been curious to me. How is it that some words get really recognized and some words don't? I want to talk a little bit more about bakery. It does mean baked goods. It's a direct translation from German. And here, this is from the Covington Music Festival several years ago, and it was a food stand, and they said, all bakery fresh from Lowry's pasty shop. And you can see here, bakery is meaning the baked goods themselves, not the place where they were baked. You never see t-shirts with, I want bakery, but you'll see t-shirts that say things like, I know how to pronounce sauna. How is it that bakery has, when it's such an important word and delicious things, slide under the radar of what it means to sound like a Yooper. On the other hand, we have words like pank, when you ask people what's an iconic or stereotypical or word that's really related to the UP, people who are from mining communities will often use the word pank or say pank, and they'll recognize this word. And this is an entry from the Dictionary of American Regional English. What's interesting to me, though, is that even though you can see in this entry that the word pank is chiefly from northern Michigan, meaning the UP, but it's also used in Pennsylvania and upstate New York. So pank isn't unique to the UP, despite the fact that people think it is. And in fact, yesterday I was on Facebook and someone had posted on one of the Yooper groups I'm a part of, and they had asked the question, what are some words that are unique to the UP? And many people said, there were over 600 comments, many people said pank. But you can see here it's not unique to the UP. What does Michigan, Pennsylvania, and upstate New York have in common? These areas where pank is used anyway are all mining communities. So we think it came in through the miners. It means to pat down or make compact. You can paint berries in a bucket or laundry in a basket. And it probably is a combination of pack and spank, but we can compare that to Norwegian and Danish and Swedish that all have the word banka. And it probably comes from that because Danes, Norwegians, and Swedes were also miners in these areas. And here you can see in the entries just some examples from some of the places, the data that they collected from interviews, what people said. For example, our snow is often too deep to dig a path, so we don snowshoes and stamp along snow, and finally it becomes hard and crusted enough to walk in without snowshoes. The process we call panking a path. So what's interesting to me with this word is that not only is it not unique to the UP, I'm sorry to say, because it's a really great word, but it also shows the linguistic history of the area and who immigrated and where they settled and how their languages have affected English today. I'll move now into talking about the syntactic features, or what we call grammar, and this is words and phrases and how we order words. I'll get a little technical here. I want to talk about the illative phrase. Illative phrases are phrases that show movement to or toward a place. And in the UP, you often will hear people use a phrase like, let's go shopko, without the and the preposition to. And this is a direct contact English transfer from Finnish, excuse me. So instead of saying, let's go to the mall, you'll hear people say, let's go mall, or I went post office instead of I went post office. There's nothing wrong with this. It's just a direct translation from Finnish. Finnish doesn't use prepositions, and Finnish doesn't have articles like a, and the. And instead of prepositions or words that show relationship between nouns, for example, going to the mall, us and going to the mall, Finnish uses postpositions or suffixes on the ends of nouns to show that, and English doesn't use those. So when Finnish speakers spoke English or speak English, sometimes they'll leave those out. In general, you'll hear an absence of prepositions like in and at, and I had mentioned the articles a, and the, again, language transfer from Finnish. Then the tags a and hey. A is used more by older speakers and hey is used more by younger speakers. You might hear someone say, have a nice dress, A, or excuse me, have a nice day, A, or that's a pretty dress, hey. And again, this is language transfer, maybe from Cornish English, because there's A there. And Cornish English were the first English speakers outside of Americans from the Midwest and Boston area to arrive. And the Cornish were often seen as model English speakers because they did speak English. Anishinaabe or Ojibwe also has in, and Canadian French also has hien. And all of these were, or of course the Ojibwe were already there. And then the Canadian French and Cornish were early settlers, that they all have this same tag or ending to a phrase, and it all means the same thing and it all sounds the same. So we're not sure where it comes from, but the interesting thing that it's hung on in the way, and it's even changing. Like I said, A is changing more and more to younger people saying hey instead. I want to talk too about the effects of language attitudes. As we saw in these examples, These aren't what some people would say is proper English or good English. Most linguists would say that this is a proper Yooper Talk. It's a proper dialect. These are the rules that make the dialect a dialect. Not everyone uses these, but when people do, there's nothing wrong with it, good or bad. It's just the way the dialect is. And dialect language attitudes are another way that affect dialects, how they emerge over time, who uses them, when they use them, and even if they stick around. Because sometimes if we criticize dialects a lot, then people don't use them as much. And I want to show an example of that here. This is an example from a university student's essay, and it demonstrates how language attitudes can and do affect individuals and can also affect the dialect itself by shaming people into not using it. And I'll read this to you and then talk a little bit about it. 3 summers ago, while attending classes, I was sitting in class listening to the professor read over the syllabus. She veered from the syllabus when she began speaking about the upcoming oral presentations. At this point, she polled the class to find out how many Yoopers were in attendance. I looked around and no one raised a hand, including myself. So you know there were other Yoopers in attendance here. I did this for 3 reasons. 1, I was a freshman. 2, the class terrified me. And 3, I was not going to be studied all term as if I were a dying species. She continued with a comment about Yoopers who attend the university by stating, when they're giving presentations, I always feel so sorry for them. The class chuckled, agreeing that Yoopers sound funny, and showed sympathy. About 10 minutes later, I left the class and almost left the university. Linguistic prejudice and language attitudes have real and lasting effects, and we can see this here. And for those who are labeled as speaking bad English, as this professor obviously thought Yooper Talk was, whether it's a social variety like African American English, or a regional variety like Yooper Talk, or what I might sound like from being from Columbus, Ohio, or wherever you might be from. For this student, the effects were significant. They dropped the class and they almost dropped out of college. Part of my interest in studying Yooper Talk and language variation and change in general is my belief that we can foster social understanding, compassion, respect by creating language awareness. The more we understand about a dialect, its history, the history of the people who speak it, the more we can come to understand that a dialect is a dialect, a variety of a language, not something bad English or something to make fun of or to criticize. This understanding can lead us to know that dialects are not seen necessarily as bad English or improper. They're actually rule governed. For example, when I showed the examples from syntax, I explained the rules that affect the use of not using prepositions, for example, or when I talked about the sounds, talked about the phonological rules that affected those sounds of dub instead of the. We can also become aware that although the rules make up regional dialects may vary from what we recognize as mainstream English, they're different rather than wrong or incorrect. And that's why in linguistics we tend to call dialects or accents varieties rather than dialects. Unfortunately, the prejudice is often attached to, that's attached to dialects and accent isn't grounded in linguistic facts, but instead about prejudice about the people who speak them. Linguistic prejudice is a mirror of social prejudice. Go anywhere in the US, go anywhere in your state, go anywhere in the world. And if you want to find out what groups are stigmatized, find out what dialects or languages are stigmatized, and vice versa. It's important to realize that all of us, you, me, your high school English teacher, we all have a dialect. No one is dialect free. It's the attitudes and values that we attach to particular ways of speaking that make them seem good or bad English. In that way, these are perceptions, right? It's not grounded in linguistic fact. All dialects are grammatical and rule driven, and the rules vary. That's how we get these different varieties or different dialects. As we've seen in all of the examples I've shown you, history and interaction resulting in language contact are the key ingredients that have shaped the variety of American English that we recognize as Yooper Talk. And here we see how attitudes toward dialects and perceptions of dialect speakers are also significant factors in shaping dialects and affecting their use. While there are negative stereotypes attached to what it means to be a Yooper and to sound like a Yooper, at the same time, there's great pride in it being a Yooper or sounding like a Yooper. For example, in the UP, there comes a fierce pride from being local, a do-it-yourself, get by with what you have, independence that's rooted in a history of hard labor in an isolated place that's very difficult to live in, with to know that you have sometimes 9 months of year and the other seasons, lots of big bugs, biting bugs. And this magnet reflects this connections between identity, place, and language with proud, tough, independent, and with Yooper mapped right onto the outline of the UP. Reflected in this magnet is the most compelling reason for the maintenance of dialect differences. Our language is one of the most obvious ways that we show who we are, where we're from, who our families are, who our people are, where our communities are, our social class, gender, sexuality, religion even, our ethnic backgrounds, our races, excuse me, even our education. These are all ways that we show who we are through our language. In that way, language is our badge of identity. How else do we show where we are, where we're from, or where we've been, who we are? And for this reason, dialects, including Yooper Talk, are not dying out. They change over time, and they must change as society changes. And some studies show that some features of dialects get stronger, even when people from the outside move to a certain place. As the linguistic landscape shrinks through our online and geographic interconnectedness, local ways of speaking remain our badge of identity, and thus dialects are here to stay. Excuse me. Sorry, I'm having technical problems here. And so to conclude, how do dialects like Yooper Talk emerge? Over time and through interaction, through us. As we shape history, as we share our attitudes and beliefs about dialects in social media and conversation. As with any dialect, the sounds, words, and phrases and sentence structures combine in unique ways to create UP English. By knowing the history of UP English, we come to understand how people, place, and language are tightly bound together. My hope is that by understanding the history of Yooper Talk, that you've come to understand not only how and why dialects develop in general, but also that we each have a role in affecting language change, as well as affecting language attitudes and perceptions of dialect speakers. Excuse me. I also hope that this understanding leads you to an appreciation of the UP, of Yoopers, for language variation in all its forms, especially Yooper Talk. Thank you. And now I'll switch slides here and we'll have some time for questions.
All right, so back in the beginning, Jill asked, are there other words for calling people in the UP in addition to Yooper?
Well, some people will call, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, good. Finn or Finlander, but those are the only ones that I know of. There are some other ones actually for people who are Cornish, but I don't think they're used anymore, like Cousin Jenny and Cousin Jack. Beth Simon wrote an article, I can't remember what its title is, but she talked about some of these terms, especially derogatory terms from the early 1900s, and how they reflected some of these ethnic attitudes about ethnicities. If you want the citation, you can email me at Grand Valley and I can get you that citation and you can look it up.
And then we had a couple comments about the use of a. One person wondered if it's Canadianism or if that's incorrect, if it came from Canada.
Well, we think it came from well, in Canada, it surely came from British speakers, right? Because, and from, well, it developed from Canadian French. But in the UP, we think it came from Cornish English speakers, Ojibwe, like I mentioned, and French Canadian, or Canadian French, because they all have a similar sounding tag question or A sound, like N, En, and A in Cornish English. And so it probably came from there. It's probably maintained in the eastern part of the UP, more from Canadian English. But if you're a Yooper, you don't want to be identified as a Canadian, even though when you leave the area, many people think you are Canadian from the way you talk because they hear your vowels and maybe the use of A. But it probably didn't come from there because that developed a later time.
So the other comment about A was that Jill shared that her cousins and aunt in Menominee use hey more than A.
Yeah, so that's interesting. So there was a student at Michigan Tech who did a study, and she looked at the use of A and hey, and she found that there were age differences. And older people used A more often, and not everybody, but more often. And younger people, maybe your cousins and aunt, use hey. And her study led her to find out that it was because of attitudes, age attitudes, that younger speakers didn't want to be identified as old, so they were not wanting to sound like their grandmas, grandpas, and parents. So it switched over to hey, which is close in sound, and it still has the same syntactic or grammatical feature or meaning. And that's probably what has happened in your family as well, as this age, what we call an age-graded change, language change.
And then Ben also commented that he often notices A and hey at the end of the sentence.
Yeah, and so that's very similar. So you'll hear them both used. And some people might use them interchangeably.
So Jill also wanted more examples of stressed voiceless stops. Do you have any more?
Well, so it'll be those three sounds, p, t, and k. Not always represented by P, T, and K, but usually. Let me see. People say camp, they might say that. Well, there's a consonant cluster at the end. It might not be so much there, but it's always at the end of a syllable. I'm trying to think. No, I can't think of any off the top of my head. I'm sorry about that. If you want to email me, I'll send you some more examples. Winter, book, stop. Pot would be another one. Pot. Just think of words that have that. And not all speakers will use these, but some will.
Okay, so Ben also made a comment that some people pronounce ishpeming as ishperming.
Yeah.
He wonders where that R sound comes from.
That's a good question. We're not quite sure where that comes from, but I know I've heard it, and so I've heard it enough that sometimes in my head I will say ishperming. It might be an ease of pronunciation, but that's a really good question that unfortunately we don't have an answer to.
And then Ben also mentioned that all the shop codes are closed now, and there were a couple other comments where people were saying they missed them.
Yeah, Shopko was a great store. It was a small department store kind of place where you could buy everything in reasonable prices, and it was also fun to say, let's go Shopko.
So Kathryn asked, she wonders where, what the derivative or where does Finnish come from? You mentioned that Finnish and English are not related.
Yeah, Finnish is in a very small group of languages. They're called the Finno-Ugric languages, Finnish, Hungarian, and Estonian. And those three languages are in that language family, and they're the only ones that are related. And Finland and Estonia are close. They're right across the Baltic Sea from each other, but Hungary is not. So there must have been a migration of people at one time that brought the languages up north to Estonia and Finland, because those places were settled after more Central Europe was settled.
And then Barbara made a comment, most people up and gay in the Q and A still use A.
Yes, I would agree with that, yeah.
Jenna asks, how does humor or joke sound in Finnish and Yooper?
I'm not really, I really don't know what, if they could clarify, do they mean like how people would pronounce them, or do they mean are there jokes? There are these standard jokes about Toivo and Eino, who are these two stock Finnish American characters who do all kinds of not necessarily polite things. But I'm not quite sure what you mean by sound like.
Jenna, you're feel free to unmute yourself.
Okay. Yeah, I wondered, like, how do they tell a joke? Do they use sarcasm, or what does what type of humor, what's like an example of a joke in Finnish or in like Yooper Talk?
Well, there's probably, I haven't studied jokes that much, but I do know, look at work by James P. Leary. He's a University of Wisconsin folklorist he has a book called So Ole Says to Lena, and he's done a lot of research on jokes. But I do know from reading his work and just what I've observed, there's a lot of self-deprecating humor. But I think like anywhere, there's going to be sarcasm, jokes, puns, jokes are jokes.
Yeah.
But there is a lot of self-deprecating humor, especially with the Toivo and Eino jokes.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for your question.
And then I know this is out of context now, but Barbara made a comment that instead of hot, it's often pronounced hot. I can't.
Hot. And that's that when I was saying that there's that ah sound, or that, well, I said ah sound, but there's the ah sound like in hot that changes. Your tongue will go low and back to hot. Yeah.
And then Kathryn asks, how did you choose whom to interview for your research?
Well, I started with friends, and then I went to friends of friends and friends of friends and friends. There's a very technical term for this, the snowball technique, where you just start connecting with people who, one, it gives you some credibility because I can say, oh, my friend Denise suggested I talk with you, or my friend Kitty said, you would be a good person to talk with. Some of that, though, ends up having some problems because what ended up happening for me anyway was that because of the people I started asking and their friends and friends, I ended up talking to more people with Finnish American background. I never met and talked with anyone from friends of friends who were Italian. I had to go out of my way to find those people. So sometimes it's often a really good research method to connect with people, but you have to also then think, okay, who am I missing here?
Here's another couple of comments about pronunciation. So one person mentioned that roof is rough and root beer is rut beer, and another person said rut cellar.
And you hear that in different parts of Michigan too. So where I'll say root, people will say rut, or I say the word route, R-O-U-T-E, and some people will say root. So yes, those words vary in a lot of different places throughout the Midwest, as well all over the US, really. Yeah.
CJ asks, are there any other region-specific dialects in Michigan? I grew up in the Thumb and have gotten comments about my accent, and I have too, CJ.
Sure there are. Wherever you're going to, wherever you are in a place, there are going to be regional variations. And regional varieties, excuse me. But some of them aren't as recognizable, or they don't get, there's a term for this, enregistered, so they get recognized in a way. So the UP is highly recognized, but it's because of tourism, I think, in part. You can find t-shirts and bumper stickers and coffee mugs and hats and all kinds of stuff. But in the Thumb, I've never seen dialect features on a postcard even, right? So there's that. There's also, so all over Michigan, you're going to find that. Anywhere you're going to go, they're going to find regional variation because people don't all live in the same place and mix and mingle in the same ways.
Emily asks, are there any influences from the Croatian or Belgian heritage?
Belgian, I'm not sure of. I've not found any evidence of that, but Croatian for sure. So the pavatica, which is a pastry, it's a rolled pastry with walnuts in it, and it takes a really long time to make. There's that. There's also in Calumet, there's a church that has the Cyrillic alphabet on some of the stained glass windows. If you go to some of the cemeteries, you'll see Cyrillic alphabet on some of the gravestones. So in those ways, but because many of the people who immigrated from what was then the Austrian Empire, and when today would be divided up into Germany, Austria, Serbia, Croatia, and that divide is even more recent. They all spoke German usually too, so that was probably more of an influence than anything else. I haven't heard any, outside of pavatica, I don't know of any other influence. And I've only seen evidence then in the writing, like I mentioned.
So Elaine asks, where does use come from? We used to say use guys when talking to friends.
Use comes right out of Irish English. So if you go to Pittsburgh and you hear yins, that's a variation of use. Use in the UP or other places that you use, that's a direct out of Irish English.
Connie says Jim Kurtu from Finlandia explained that lots of Finns who came here to work in the mines were actually just 1 or 2 generations away from being Norwegians. And because Norwegians moved to Finland to work in the mines, then they or their children came to Copper Country to work the mines here. So Finns might have some of that Norwegian language pronunciations too.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And especially if people came from the northern part of Finland, which is people known as Sami, and you might have heard Jim Kurti talk about that too, because that northern part of Finland, I can't really do it with my fingers, but it touches Norway and Sweden. So there's some language mixing there. And that when I showed the photo of those Norwegians and I said, well, they surely spoke Norwegian, but they might have spoken Swedish, Danish, or Finnish too. Sure, there was all of that kind of mixing and mingling, especially because of migration, whether it was because of famine or war or work like mining, like you say. That was a good point, thanks.
Ben says he really enjoyed this, thank you, and he looks forward to the book, wishing everyone lots of sisu to help get through this crazy year. Thank you, Ben.
Thanks, Ben. So sisu, I have my mug here. I was drinking out of it earlier. Means strong perseverance in the face of adversity. We all need that right now. Oh, you can't see it there. So yes, I hope you all have sisu. Are there any other questions?
Yeah, so okay. There we have 3 at the bottom. So Barbara wants to know what the name of your book is.
It's called Yooper Talk, Dialect as Identity in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. And it's in paperback and hardback.
And then Kathryn says, are you currently doing additional research on this topic and/or are you doing new research on other topics?
Well, I'm doing a research project that's a combination of new and old. So I have a collaborative project with Elizabeth Peterson. She's at the University of Helsinki, and her research site's in Utah with Danish heritage speakers. And of course, mine's in the UP looking at Finnish Americans. And we're looking at the use of the word ja in American English. And how is it that this word ja, not yeah, but ja meaning yes, but it also means a lot of different things depending on how it's used. We're researching the meanings and the uses, but how is that stuck around, especially when it's foreign sounding and it's a foreign word, kind of like sauna. How is it stuck around like that? So it's a project that we started last year. We were supposed to go to the UP this summer to collect more data. And we've had 3 research assistants, undergrads, working with us on that project. But of course, with staying home, well, we've stayed home and our research is on hold for right now, unfortunately.
Elaine mentions there's a large Italian community in Iron Mountain. Is there any influence to Yooper Talk?
Oh, I'm sure there is, yeah. And I had mentioned that was one group that I didn't have as much contact with. But you see that even in Houghton. And in Marquette, I don't know if you're familiar with the word kudigi, and kudigi is a kind of sausage, but it sounds like an Italian word, but it's kind of a made-up Italian word just by Americans in Marquette, who invented or created this kind of sausage patty. So there's that influence, but you're right, especially Iron Mountain, there were a lot more Italians who settled there than in some of the other places. But all throughout the northwestern UP, you'll find Italians, and you'll find them in certain settlement areas. Russ Magnaggi, who's a retired professor from Northern Michigan, has written a lot about Italians in the UP, and you might want to look at his work.
So I'm curious if a lot of people who use different words from different dialects are ever really aware of it. And because you were talking about how people use ya and yeah, and if they realize that it's kind of taken from other places. Have you noticed that in your research?
Yeah, I think, you know, it's two things. I think sometimes people notice it and they play it up, right? So one person I interviewed in 2002, people telling you have to go interview this man, you have to go interview this man. So I did, and what I realized was that he was what we would call a very good performer, right? And he was putting it on for me, which was great because I was really entertained, and he gave me a lot of data, but it wasn't naturally occurring language. On the other hand, I think that we use language sometimes without we do a lot without recognizing it. And sometimes it's when people point things out to us that we, one, understand the history of it, or that we even recognize that we're saying yeah for yeah or yes.
Well, are there any more questions for Kathryn? If not, I really want to thank you so much for joining us tonight, and thank you, Kathryn, for sharing all of your expertise and research with us. It has been incredibly fascinating.
Thank you. Thanks. Oh,
Susan
sorry.
has her hand up here. So I'm going to ask you on mute. Let's see here. Are you able to unmute? Okay, here we go.
I didn't have a question. I'm just clapping.
Oh, okay, that's clapping. All right. I'm sorry, my confusion.
That's fine.
One last question. Jill asks, what about OPE?
Yeah, what about OPE? Well, OPE, people think, again, this is a Michigan thing, but it's used in other places. So if I bump into you, say, oh, you know, it's one of those good words that we can show some politeness without being overly polite. Oh, excuse me, right? But it is used outside of Michigan, even though if you look online, many people think it's a Michigan thing.
I've actually used it when bumping into inanimate objects. It's like second nature to just say.
Yeah.
Emily says, are you still looking for native Yoopers who have never moved to interview for language studies?
Well, not right now because we're on this restriction and we're not doing any kind of data collection right now, but perhaps next summer. And if you know of someone or you're interested, just send me an email and we'll make contact somehow.
Should I share your email in the chat? Do you think
oh, sure, that would be great. That'd be fine. Do you want me to write it, tell you what it is?
Yeah, that would be good. I don't remember.
It's Remling, REMLINGK at gvsu.edu. And if you can't remember all that, just go to Grand Valley State University's website and type in my name and it'll pop up. Or you can Google it. Although there's another Kathryn Remlinger who makes horror films. That's not me. I want to thank everybody. I want to say hi to my mom, my aunt, my former office mate and friend, Denise, and anybody else who's there. It was really great to share all this with all of you, and really happy. Thank you very much again, Katie. This was a pure joy.
Thank you. I'm just so happy to host you, and I learned a lot, and I know everybody else was super enthusiastic about everything you shared. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.